Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for joining me on a Friday afternoon. I'm going to reset the timer so I know if I'm going to go over or not, because I'm not going to cut any slides unless I really do go over. So I thought I had a pretty good grip on reality until I started researching for this talk. You see, a lot of our reality is actually formed through our senses. And these senses served us really well during our evolution, but now we're not really immune to modern day trickery. They kind of abuse our senses, manipulate how we think, for better, sometimes for better, sometimes for the worse. So before we go down the rabbit hole of this topic, I'm going to do a little bit of a reading in the room about our ideas of reality and a bit of a quiz. So, 3 questions. Does anybody want to have a crack at answering these questions? And you'll get a prize based on your earnestness, not necessarily your correctitude. It's a copy of Critical Thinking by Stella Cottrell. Anybody want to have a go? Come on. Yeah. Put your hand up. Put your hand up. Somebody put the hand up. There you go. Right. Okay, you can have it in advance as a show of good faith. But you're going to try and answer these 3 questions. Who invented the light bulb? Were you at my thing yesterday? No. All right. Yeah, okay, good. Who invented the printing press? Yeah. How about the internet? I thought you said Tim Burton at first. It's definitely not Tim Burton. No, that was the web. Yeah. So typical answers you get from a lot of people would be Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. And, of course, Al Gore invented the internet. Now, these are not really true. But they're also not entirely false at the same time. But I should really properly introduce myself. I'm Jeff Watkins. I'm the CTO of a company called Create Future. We're an Edinburgh-based tech consultancy, 500 people strong. We have particular expertise in software engineering, product, cloud, AI services, et cetera, et cetera. And we do, data and AI services being quite a la mode. But I'm not going to get too salesy, so plug over. I'm not going to mention my employer again. I'm from an engineering background, and I'm really interested, though, in the societal impacts of technology, because I spent all my time coding and then realizing there's actually a world outside of my basement. Particularly AI, which I'm studying a master's in at the moment, and also cybersecurity, which was my last master's. So I like to sort of blend the 2 ideas together when it comes to security and artificial intelligence. So, back to the talk. Quite a lot of truths we hold almost as axioms are actually a bit shaky. Same with the questions. Edison did not invent the filament light bulb. He innovated with it and brought it to the masses. Gutenberg invented a kind of printing press, but actually movable block printing presses were invented in Korea about 200 years earlier. And as for the Al Gore joke, he actually did play a key role in securing funding for the US development of the internet. So it's about as accurate as the other claims. Why am I telling you this? Because they're all, in a way, forms of misinformation. But having the facts right in this case aren't that important to your daily life. They're not salient to you unless you're a historian or maybe Al Gore. So for most, it doesn't matter. It's not important. It's not going to change how we feel or think and things like that. But there's shortcuts to a deeper topic, which is fine. For example, I have this quote on screen, which I use a lot in talks. I like to be, evidence and data driven. In God we trust, all others must bring data, by W.E. Deming. Except that Deming didn't actually, I found out after using it for several years, Deming didn't actually say this. Even IBM used this quote on some of their sites, and it's not him at all. So if I'm, as an aside, I'm going to talk about lies a lot in this talk. And I'll try and stay away from the truth as an absolute concept. Not because you can't handle a truth, but because it's philosophically problematic to define truth objectively, and unless it's like a mathematic proof or something. Okay. So misinformation is as old as time. Early examples happened in the Roman Empire, printed on coins about salacious rumors about Cleopatra. Pretty clever way to spread your message. And misinformation isn't always in the forms of words. It can be images. Take this example of early photoshopping, where Stalin's pictures seem to get less and less crowded as he goes across, as his advisors were fired. And when I say fired, I mean fired at. Yeah. I'm sure Stalin would have loved Instagram filters as well. Look at him. Absolute Chad. Anyway, and it's funny how, sometimes history kind of repeats itself. No, poor Sam's looking a little bit lonely there. Anyway, Before we get into the meat of things, it's possibly helpful to frame this all with a very brief history of information. When I talk about information, really there's three key factors: the speed of transmission, the breadth of that distribution, and the cost of the production. And opinions divided, like exactly when we formed the ability to communicate hundreds of thousands of years ago. But the first evidence of written communication is 5,000 years ago, when, this is when things started to get set in stone, like, pardon the pun. And the first time, by the time books have been written about 4,000 years ago, and these were copied by monks and scholars. I think people went over this as well. But speed and distribution were limited, and because they were manually copied, the production costs were very, very high. And then the movable typeset printing press came along, and distribution got easier and reduced costs. But we're still limited by the physical distribution speed. And this entire lot lasted 4,900 years, roughly. Now, the first radio broadcast is considered to be in 1906 on Christmas Eve, and it didn't just enable radio transmissions, but also the telegraphs of stories and other information. So now we have wide distribution and a high speed, and we're entering the phase of mass media. The rise of cinema was also around this time, slower than telegraph in distribution, but it brought visual media to the masses, properly for the first time. Then we had the first television broadcast in 1926 by Scottish inventor John Logie Baird. And then we very quickly moved into the era of globally distributed audio visual media. But the key thing about mass media thus far is it is a closed shop. The media giants, the news outlets, the big channels, all owned it all. And you had no personal voice, and that phase lasted about 80 to 90 years. Then we enter into the era of online media. Although the internet itself dates back to the 50s, in the 90s, thanks to Sir Tim Berners-Lee, we got the web. The first social media site, 6 Degrees, was formed in 1997, only coming maybe 4 or 5 years after the web was created. And then in 2007, Facebook introduced something called the EdgeRank algorithm onto its newsfeed, which is widely regarded as being the very first social media algorithm, inadvertently giving birth to what we now know as the filter bubble, which you've probably heard of. And then, of course, came generative AI, which is the catalyst for all of us being here today, unless you were at the wrong conference. And it's transformed our online experience. Now, this last phase has all happened in less than 30 years, which to me is pretty wild. So this time is getting crunched down. And thanks to our rapid advancements, the amount of information on the web is snowballing. Not just written, but audio and visual images. The graph here is actually in zettabytes, which are thousands of petabytes, each of which is thousands of times the size of your laptop's hard disk. In 2015, it was discussed, somebody had calculated all the social media shared photos, just shared photos, for that 1 year, were more than all of the photographs taken in the entirety of film history. And that was in 2015. So now it'd be probably doing a month. And it's been shown that generative AI is actually contributing to this expansion of online information, which I'm sure you've seen yourself and we discussed earlier. But not all information is good, not all information is bad or even useful. So let's go over some definitions, kind of the meat of the topic, our four horsemen of the information apocalypse. Firstly, we have misinformation. This is information that is wholly or partially incorrect. And academia can't decide if this should be the umbrella term for all kind of internet lies or lies in general, for reasons I'll go over in a second. So some definitions basically say that it's only bad information that's spread without the knowledge that it's wrong. Unintentional mistruths, usually forwarded by people in a long chain of social media. And this makes it kind of crucially different from our second one. Disinformation. Now, this information is wholly or partially incorrect, but spread intentionally with the knowledge that it's wrong, with the purpose of deceiving the reader. Now, quite often we refer to modern disinformation as fake news, but that's kind of too narrow a term because actually it's not all on news sites. It floats around in other mediums. Now, you think that because you're here, you may be too gigabrain to be taken in by disinformation. Unfortunately, some studies have shown that the higher your level of education, unfortunately, the more susceptible you are to disinformation. And unfortunately, some other studies actually show the opposite, so even that might be misinformation. But now, unfortunately, for a number of people in the room, most studies agree that men are the worst, or maybe you say best, if you like. People taking an absolute nonsense online by quite a wide margin, really, so sorry, fellas. And then we have malinformation. This is information that's largely or wholly true, but lacking important context. And the aim is to actually deceive by partial truth. A good example is Donald Trump's recent attack on Kamala Harris, that she'd failed a bar exam, which is true, like half of people who take the bar exam. But then she actually passed it on a subsequent attempt, which he didn't say. Malinformation can also include things like doxing people to cause them harm. It's basically good information gone bad. But for convenience sake, going forward in the talk, I'll be referring to all of these under the term misinformation, as the net result is the same, even though the intent differs. And as misinformation is a populist activity, in modern times we're seeing misinformation being aimed at the common person, as a rally against experts, where experts are actually being shown as a corrupt elite. So J.D. Vance, this gentleman here, was quite in a recent debate where he stated that we should stop listening to experts and start listening to common sense. Now that's a very American thing to say. However, though, during the EU referendum, Michael Gove said, people have had enough of experts, with commentators saying that we're now entered into a post-truth age, which is kind of scary. Which is how you end up with things like vaccine uptake dropping off, climate change and all those kind of things. And this is commonly known as the people's truth, i.e. bullshit. Will that get translated? Who knows? One of the other problems with mistruths is they often target audiences who want to hear them. Studies have shown that misinformation that isn't in line with your way of thinking actually doesn't have much effect. But the lies actually matter and they stick. In 1912, the Oregon Supreme Court issued a statement because they were finding it very problematic that people say stuff in court that will then be struck from the record, but it had an effect. And he said, it's not an easy task to unring a bell, nor to remove from the mind an impression once imprinted there. I think pretty on the nose with that one. And what's worse is its pervasiveness. With misinformation that's repeated over and over again on multiple platforms, you see it multiple times, often presented in different formats. And studies have shown that basically something that, even if you know it's a lie, if it keeps being repeated to you multiple times, eventually becomes in your mind or can become the truth, even if you don't necessarily believe it when you start thinking about it properly. Now, George Orwell coined the term doublethink in regards to this in his book 1984, but it's more commonly known as the illusory truth effect. So that's a bit about the impact. What about the spread? Now, like with the R0 of an infectious disease, we can try and measure the transmission rate of misinformation across the internet. And the R0 refers to how many people an infected individual pass on to another one. And when it comes to things like platforms like X and actually WhatsApp in many other countries, actually WhatsApp is the predominant platform. Several studies have shown this can get really, really quickly out of hand. And that even asymptomatic people, quite often, they just go, I'll just repost it anyway, without actually checking the facts. And they're becoming a big part of the problem. So an individual who's on many multiple online groups can actually have an R0 of 5,000 plus, and this is like a normal member of the public. But usually it's only the juicy stuff that gets reshared, not the corrections or the retractions, because they're not really salacious. And to quote the satirist Jonathan Swift, falsehood flies and the truth kind of comes limping after. For example, there's an MIT study that showed the effects of fake news, and it was mistakenly claimed by media outlets as having been disproven, which went really viral online. And then when the news outlet went, sorry, we'll issue a correction, nobody saw it. To which the authors of the original study said, just as we predicted, the irony is not lost on anybody involved in that. But the intention of many of these lies is to actually polarize. The book Factfulness kind of goes into the concept of polarization quite a bit. Sources of disinformation do want us to be classified into buckets rather than live on a continuum, as life isn't black and white. And it's helpful to rally people to their side and keep them there for engagement. And one of the side effects of being continued exposure to polarized information is a tendency to become even more polarized and seek even more extreme forms of that information. This is known as a rabbit hole. For clarity, the gentleman here on the left is Alex Jones, who is very interested in the private life of frogs, and not Hans Rosling, the author of the book on the right, who I'm sure is a lovely person. And thankfully, figures have actually shown that it's not as common and as impactful as we've maybe been led to believe by the media, ironically. But we do see it materialize in things like conspiracy theories and also really bad acts of extremism. And actually our social media sites and algorithms are really set up to deal with all this and to actually promote it. And the term filter bubble is actually entirely based on algorithms pushing people down paths of certain types of information. So how do you polarize with lies in the algorithm? Well, you actually go to the extreme. I'm sure we've all seen posts like this. You know, weird conspiracy theory nut stuff. And researchers found there's a tendency towards engagement on the fringe of what is called, acceptable content on a platform, where you hit an almost exponential curve of engagement as we actually reach that prohibited content line. And there you go. That's the curve from a study. And platforms such as Facebook have actually attempted to implement algorithms to effectively invert this curve by down promoting, but not banning the close to wire content. But then there's plenty of complaints of that is actually the stuff that's getting kind of down promoted here is actually an infringement of free speech. But I don't know, I have limited sympathy for that. And then we have really come to how is AI influencing all these issues? Now, until recently, I'm sure AI was, for most of us, was for solving specific problems, thinking, analysis. But now you can create content at scale in multimedia, and it doesn't care about what kind of harms or issues it can cause. Sure, the big players, like OpenAI, putting controls in place, but these are quite easily circumvented. And Gen AI technology is available, as we've seen on some of the other things, on your laptop or on dark web services. And it's a real problem when it comes to misinformation, because it does three things really well. It's capable of improving the persuasiveness of an argument or a piece of material, of misleading content. It can also personalize to target groups or individuals at scale. And it does it really, really bloody quickly and cheaply at scale without any need for any human intervention. And of course, AI is actually being innocently used by people without engaging any critical thinking. Yeah? It's AI, therefore it must be correct, which is quite a bad assumption to make, I think. And it's really hard to actually find figures around online misinformation, AI especially, once it's spread, because it's quite difficult to detect. However, it can correlate with something we can measure, phishing attacks, which in late 2023 to 2024 went up by more than 400%, thanks to Gen AI. And despite Gen AI being relatively new on the block, a lot of social misinformation has actually been automated for some time. But prior to generative AI, bot armies had a problem. They were pretty easy to rumble. They were predictable, and they couldn't have a coherent debate with you. When the Russia and Ukraine situation kicked off, suddenly tens of thousands of accounts that had been consistently spreading COVID conspiracy theories suddenly switched overnight to pro-Russia propaganda. So that's a pretty obvious tell that they weren't genuine. But now this is changing over time as AI-based bots are becoming more sophisticated and it's getting harder to detect. And this has led to some scaremongering around this, like this post that I think was eventually seen by millions of people, looking like some kind of Russian attempt to use ChatGPT to spread misinformation. But let's not get too disheartened. That, Jason, was absolute nonsense, and that in itself was misinformation. It's somewhat over-reported at the moment, we think. So that post was discredited. But as I said earlier, like the falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. And this is a global concern, really. I mean, the World Economic Forum notes that this is one of the top risks behind extreme weather. Yeah, I guess that depends on where you live, but I imagine some people in the US would probably agree right now. But AI is not necessarily a villain in this story. It also plays a crucial role in combating misinformation. Advanced AI-driven systems can analyze patterns, language use, and context to actually aid in content moderation, fact-checking, and the detection of false information. So the WEF are actually really, really on this one. They think this is actually a really big risk we need to counter. And what's, I think, more worrying is when AI is used to attack our other senses, hearing and vision. And unfortunately, sight and sound kind of bypass some of our reasoning sometimes. We're used to being able to believe what we see or hear, even if we knew already not to trust everything we read. Now, Elon Musk, who for some reason endorses Trump, posted this fake image of Kamala Harris with a communist hammer and sickle. It's had 83.9 million views. And a reverse image search suggested this is the earliest posting of this image on X. Thanks, Elon. But deepfakes actually have a more problematic thing aligned to them. That's something called the liar's dividend. Now everything can be faked. If you're caught doing something really outrageous on some media, you can just go, oh, that was faked. And that wasn't plausible. a few years ago, a decade ago certainly. But it all erodes trust in what we see and hear. And then people fall back to what they want to believe. You could imagine Trump doing all kinds of stuff and they'll say, oh, it's faked. Wouldn't matter. People will still believe what they want to believe. Here's another recent example. Somebody was listening to a radio station in Miami when they were discussing this meme, and the people presenting said, do you see them standing in front of that picture? Do they have no shame? And she contacted them to say that actually, no, it's fake. And they issued an apology that said, yeah, that story's not true, but it doesn't take away from the reality that Kamala Harris is a Marxist. So, as I said before, it's really difficult to unring a bell. And due to technology moving faster than human and societal behavioral adaptivity, and way faster than we can actually evolve, we're now in something what people term the exploitation zone. Basically, it's really difficult for us to adapt to this multi-sensory technical overload. And this diagram is reproduced. I took a picture of it from the book Fake, which came out a few weeks ago, and annoyingly had this on the other side. For people who can't see at the back, that's Four Horsemen. I did not know about this book when I was writing this talk. I like feeling validated, but I'm still bloody annoyed. So now we have what I think is the worst of them all, the fourth horseman, noninformation. Noninformation could include misinformation, but it's in bulk and it often has no point aside from seeking some kind of engagement. We commonly know a lot of this is clickbait, but there's a distinction. You can actually have valuable content with clickbait. It can actually be a force for good. But if you've got SEO-optimized, clickbaity nonsense that actually detracts from the world of information, it gets harder to find quality content. We've all seen Where's Wally or Waldo, if there's any Americans in the audience. So it's easy to spot there. Not as easy to spot there. I did go through this pitch and try and find him. I couldn't. And when you're trying to spot him in the universe of content, things get tricky. And search engines aren't helping. I mean, well, Google especially, Google really isn't. And we'll talk about that in a second. So, one of the more common terms for non-information is slop. And it's a big problem. Not just for us, but for the platforms and threatens to drown out the real content on the web. I'm sure people have seen those awful hints and tips videos on YouTube, like 5-minute crafts and things like that. Now, 5-minute crafts has actually had over 10 billion views over its lifetime, while all it's peddling is like faked or dangerous tips and tricks and just recycling through different channels. And they're already everywhere, but the social media algorithms are actually elevating this content, and it could be their downfall. Because aside from the Four Horsemen themselves, the algorithm is actually a big problem, and it's feeding them not only on lies, but on slop. And this all leads to something called enshittification, or platform decay. The gentleman on this slide is Cory Doctorow, who coined this term, and it became Word of the Year in 2023. Might be the first time a swear word became the Word of the Year, actually. And he has a lot to say on this topic, and I recommend you actually watch some of his talks. But unfortunately, Facebook, YouTube, and even Google search are subject to this enshittification, and it's getting noticed. I mean, how do you like your rocks in the morning? However, if we allow platform decay to run rampant, we get into the danger zone for AI models themselves, because the research has shown that only a small amount of slop introduced into a model training set can actually lead to model collapse, and that's about around 1%. And we probably don't know how close we are to that event horizon, I imagine. It doesn't have to be eventuality, though. There are positive uses in modern AI which will help to combat enshittification by ensuring that the algorithm delivers both user and business goals, minimizes polarization, and chooses actual rational content. Genuine information, basically. So, as is tradition for talks, I'm going to leave you with some takeaways. We're now in an era of AI-driven algorithmic media, higher speed, volume, distribution ability, lower costs, and we can all contribute to it. We can't stop this wave of lies and slop ourselves. Big tech does need to make some changes for things to improve, and we'll likely be driven by legislation when it comes to protecting us rather than actually them doing it themselves, so that's big tech for you. Tech bros won't ever do anything unless they need to. However, we can protect ourselves and inform those closest to us, and we can be good citizens in the wider communities we're in. The first one is arm yourself. And I suggest you start using things like bias and fact checkers, like this one here, so you can check your sources for general bias as well as accuracy. And try to stick to neutral sources when you're taking stuff in, but do dip into the polarized media. I do read like the Daily Fail and stuff like that every so often, just to get stuff either side of the divide. And read some of the books I've mentioned here today. Foolproof is a great one. Fake, God damn him, and The Psychology of Misinformation, really good. And try and read up about things like cognitive biases and logical fallacies. They'll help you a lot. But the next thing is also protect others. You know, if you have relatives, especially children, get them onto basic media literacy training. There's free courses out there, like medialit.org, and UNESCO's offering it pretty good as well. Encourage them to use neutral sources, make them aware of things like deep fakes and how to spot them, and encourage them to enter into things like balanced debates. But you should also report dangerous misinformation to things like the National Cybersecurity Centre or Ofcom, and obviously social media platforms also have pretty good reporting functionality. Don't be afraid to use it. For the love of truth, don't just comment or repost damaging information. Just report it and move on. And in everyday life, you are going to come across situations where you'll need to get your message across, so why not use the weapons of the enemy to be manipulated yourself? I'm not sure how this image of Boris Johnson got onto the slide about mastering manipulation. See, that's polarizing content for you. So people aren't going to listen to you if you make your message confrontational or worse, boring. So try and use fluent communication. Make it accessible, simple, easy to absorb your message, really. Yeah. Make it persuasive, catchy, memeable, so it gets into people's brains. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Use the illusory truth effect to your advantage. Do it across multiple channels, multiple mediums. Appeal to emotion, but positive ones. You know, fear sells, but so does hope and joy and excitement. And remember, verify before you amplify. Before you post or repost something, and you know you might end up contributing to the globalized era of slop. Check things stack up. Through these tactics, we can kind of build some herd immunity, some community resilience. This war's not a solo mission. We all need all of you to engage in this war. Yeah. On top of it all, I'd urge you to do these three things through the lens of responsible AI. By all means, use AI to speed up your research and your writing. Encourage balance in what you write to make things more accessible in language. But don't just let a quick Google AI search response or ChatGPT conversation shortcut the process. Keep your critical thinking intact and your facts checked. Now, well, the writing's on the wall. There's a wanted poster with our faces on it. As we hear the hooves of the horses approaching, we see the first glimpses of our weapons of our enemies drawn. But we mustn't lose hope, because we are the main character in our own perceptions. We can build a shield of critical thinking, but with skepticism and curiosity and an open mind. We can be the rational people, even if the online world feels irrational. And when the actual shots stop ringing out, and the din of the horses falls away, and the dust will settle, we'll just be left with the truth. Well, at least what we think is the truth. Thank you.